Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. When we look at the sheer scale of China's industrial output, we have to ask a fundamental question. Are we witnessing, an unstoppable plot for world domination, as the rhetoric often suggests? Or are we simply watching the most efficient, maybe hyper-automated manufacturing engine the world has ever engineered? That tension between geopolitical anxiety and, cold, hard economic efficiency, that's really what we're digging into today. We're analyzing the undeniable growth of China as a manufacturing superpower. Our aim is to move beyond those fear-driven headlines a bit and really understand the true mechanics driving China's industrial success. We want to challenge the narrative that simple tariffs or, protectionism can stop this momentum entirely.
And we absolutely have to anchor this discussion in reality first. The idea of Chinese industrial heft isn't hyperbole. It's based on some pretty overwhelming data.
No.
China now accounts for over 30% of global manufacturing value added. Just to help you visualize that scale, that figure is actually larger than the output of the U.S., Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. This is according to UNIDO data, the UN Industry Development Organization, so the scale is unprecedented, and it keeps growing.
Right. And the immediate global friction, it seems to boil down to price, doesn't it? It's not just the massive volume, but the fact that Chinese goods are cheap, and crucially, getting cheaper right now.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about long-term efficiency gains. It's actually being driven by intense short-term domestic pressure right now. Internally, Chinese companies are locked in what you could only describe as brutal price wars across multiple sectors, especially in advanced manufacturing.
And we see that reflected in their economic indicators, right? Factory gate prices, what manufacturers actually get for their goods, they've been falling for nearly 3 years straight. The Producer Price Index, the PPI, which tracks these costs, recently showed deflation hitting negative 2.9% year over year. That's significant.
That PPI figure is a really critical piece of this puzzle. Imagine you're a factory owner in China. If your domestic prices are falling like that, your profit margins just shrink, or maybe they disappear entirely. So if you can't make money selling a component for, say, $10 at home because your competitor's selling it for $9, well, you basically have two choices. Go bankrupt, or find a market somewhere else that will still pay $11. And that market is almost always external. This deflationary cycle at home is what forces these firms to aggressively push even more volume into foreign markets. It ensures the price wars spill across borders.
Okay, so if the common rhetoric is domination, the reality is maybe more about economic optimization driven by, survival at home. That distinction seems critical. It moves us from a purely hostile zero-sum frame to one defined more by technology and efficiency.
Precisely. I think we need to stop viewing this primarily as some grand strategic plot and start recognizing it more as an automation-led efficiency cycle. And what's fascinating here, really, is that the primary driver of cost control today isn't just cheap labor anymore. That's the old story. It's capital deepening and, crucially, technology.
Yeah, that data point completely reframes the old labor narrative, doesn't it? The source material shows China's robot density. That's the number of industrial robots per 10,000 workers. It reached an astonishing 470 in 2023, which, as you said, places them third globally. Yep. That's behind only places like Singapore and South Korea, really high-tech economies.
Exactly. The sheer investment in robotics, coupled with AI integration in manufacturing processes, it allows factories to move toward what they call dark or lights-out operations. These are facilities that can run entirely automated shifts, sometimes literally without human intervention, without needing to turn the lights on. This sustained reliance on machinery, not just people, underpins their cost consistency. It allows firms to hold those competitive prices even while domestic wages in China are, in fact, still rising. They've effectively managed to decouple price competitiveness from labor costs, at least in these advanced sectors.
That image of a factory just humming along efficiently in the dark, it's a really striking picture of advanced capital deepening. And if this hyper-efficiency is driven by robotics and automation, well, that changes the calculation for global competitors entirely. If you're fighting cheap labor, you might move production elsewhere. But if you're fighting superior automated processes, you have to invest at a massive scale just to keep pace. A different game.
And this efficiency flywheel, it changes the global economic perspective too. Efficiency gains, particularly when they happen in the production of critical capital goods, think batteries, machinery, industrial components, they can actually be a global positive, because they lower costs for every company sourcing those inputs wherever they are in the world. If you're an American or European car company, for example, getting cheaper, maybe higher quality battery packs from China is actually a competitive benefit for your final electric vehicle, even if it's painful for your domestic battery suppliers. It complicates the picture.
Okay, this takes us right to the policy response then. Western powers, mainly the U.S., have put up substantial tariffs specifically designed to cut the flow of Chinese goods. Yet the overall data seems to indicate, well, a lack of success in that specific objective. China's massive trade surplus is apparently still on track to exceed $1 trillion this year. If the tariffs are there, how can the surplus still be so large?
Well, the short answer is that the tariffs haven't really stopped the trade overall. What they've done is dramatically reshape its physical routes. So while exports directly to the U.S. have certainly plunged, yes, China has sustained its massive overall surplus by leaning much more heavily on other regions: Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America.
So it's rerouting, not elimination.
Exactly, rerouting. The overall share of global export containers originating in China has actually grown since the pandemic. It's now standing at over 36%. So if you're just looking at the sheer volume of goods leaving Chinese ports, it hasn't fallen off a cliff. It's just going through different channels, different destinations first.
Okay, let's try to unpack this tariff illusion for you, the listener. If you hear policy analysts saying tariffs haven't worked as intended, there seem to be a few key reasons. First, the effects often have a lag, right? Companies often rush to ship huge volumes ahead of announced tariff deadlines, which can artificially inflate trade volumes in the short term before the tariffs really kick in.
That's one factor. Second, you see what economists call trade redirection, or sometimes third country processing. So goods destined for the U.S. might first be shipped to, say, Vietnam or Mexico or Malaysia. They might undergo some minimal final assembly step there, maybe just enough to change the label, and then they're re-exported to the U.S. under a new country of origin label. The actual value added might still be overwhelmingly Chinese, but the customs paperwork, it says something different.
Right. So the core issue for policymakers then is that the tariffs didn't just make the global demand for inexpensive Chinese goods vanish. That demand just found alternate ports and routes to get satisfied. And this severely limits the ability of U.S. policy acting alone to stop the overall export volume coming out of China.
And this leads us to a really crucial balancing force, one that the narrative of the world can't possibly absorb more Chinese goods tends to completely overlook, and that's localization.
Localization. Okay, that sounds like a potential game changer because it shifts the political vulnerability, doesn't it? Tell us more about how Chinese firms are handling this.
Well, instead of just flooding foreign markets with imports shipped from China, Chinese industrial firms, especially the big ones, are increasingly building capacity abroad. So rather than exporting finished electric vehicles from Shenzhen, firms like BYD, the huge EV manufacturer, and CATL, the world's largest battery producer, they're setting up entire assembly plants and battery factories in places like Hungary, Brazil, and Mexico.
That fundamentally changes the political discussion in those receiving countries. Instead of politicians complaining about, cheap imports destroying local industry, they might now be welcoming foreign direct investment creating jobs right here.
It absolutely does. It blurs the line between what's local production and what's foreign production. And it effectively circumvents the original intent of the tariffs, at least the U.S. ones. If BYD builds a factory in Mexico to supply the North American market, well, that factory creates local jobs, it uses local infrastructure, and it produces a final product that bypasses U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods because it's technically made in Mexico.
Yeah.
The ownership, yes, remains Chinese, but the physical location and the associated jobs are local.
And what's critical here is the spillover effect for consumers, isn't it? This massive influx of supply, whether it's direct imports or locally built capacity from Chinese firms, is profoundly disinflationary for consumers everywhere.
Yeah.
We even see some real numbers on this. The European Central Bank, for instance, estimates that redirected exports from China could shave off roughly 0.15 percentage points from euro area inflation in 2026.
That's a significant layer of complexity policymakers have to acknowledge. Low prices are damaging for local competing industries. Yes, nobody denies that. But they are undeniably beneficial for consumers and, frankly, for Western central banks desperately trying to manage persistent inflation right now. You're essentially trading some industrial pain for broader consumer relief. It's a tough trade-off.
And we also need to look at China's own internal long-term strategy here, which seems to view this huge manufacturing capacity not as some kind of mistake to be corrected, but as a national asset to be leveraged.
That's right. Their next big roadmap, the 2026-2030 5-year plan, looks intensely focused on becoming a science and technology powerhouse. They're emphasizing disruptive innovation, self-reliance, particularly in key technologies. Honestly, policymakers there probably feel entirely vindicated in their push to build this capacity, especially following previous U.S. attempts to limit their access to crucial technologies like semiconductors. In their view, maybe America didn't stop them. America just convinced them they had to double down on building everything themselves.
Okay, so given this constantly moving target, a manufacturing machine that's simultaneously automating, localizing production abroad, and operating under intense domestic deflationary pressure, how rational is the current U.S. policy response? Some experts, like senior diplomat Sarah Baran, have cautioned that the U.S. negotiating stance has also been focused on very specific, highly transactional demands.
Yeah, she points out that U.S. demands frequently center around things like, okay, China, buy more U.S. soybeans, or buy more Boeing airliners, or make sure TikTok gets licensed this way. They're not always demanding the deeper structural changes needed to address the underlying industrial overcapacity or truly level the playing field for U.S. companies operating in China.
It sounds a bit like focusing on quick, visible wins rather than addressing the structural earthquake underneath.
It can seem that way. And if China's industrial output is fundamentally becoming a more automated and increasingly multi-local system, then the only truly rational response for global powers probably isn't theatrical decoupling or relying solely on tariffs that, as we've seen, can be circumvented. It likely requires a more pragmatic, multi-pronged approach.
Okay, so what does that rational policy mix look like in practice?
Well, first, probably what you could call smart guardrails. This means moving away from broad blanket tariffs and focusing instead on targeted anti-dumping measures, and really pushing for transparent subsidy rules. You have to prove an unfair practice is actually occurring before you implement a precise surgical response, not just react to volume. And second, perhaps controversially for some, it might require more active partnering. If you genuinely can't beat the technology or the price point across the board, maybe you need to find ways to capture the benefits. This could mean pushing for joint ventures in certain areas, aligning on industrial standards where possible, and definitely investing heavily in workforce upskilling so that Western workers can handle the advanced technologies involved and capture some of the innovation benefits from this efficiency flywheel, rather than just being victims of its scale.
So for you listening, what should you be tracking as an indicator in the near term to gauge which way this complex situation is moving?
I'd say keep a close eye on outbound industrial foreign direct investment from China, FDI. Specifically, watch the timelines for firms like BYD and CATL actually getting their assembly and battery plants up and running in places like Europe and Latin America. If that localization continues rapidly, the political resistance in those host countries might shift significantly. We also need to watch whether China's own attempts at achieving capacity discipline, that means their internal efforts to steer credit away from unviable, heavily indebted firms, whether that actually starts to cool down the domestic price wars. If those internal price wars ease up, then the aggressive export drive might also ease, at least slightly. The bottom line, really, is that the sheer scale and evolving nature of China's manufacturing machine points toward a future defined not just by simple blocking or conflict, but by complex competition and perhaps unavoidable collaboration. It's a reality that seems likely to provide lower global prices for consumers, alongside these co-investment opportunities and challenges. It looks like a system you probably have to manage and integrate with in smart ways, not simply try to stop cold.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given that Chinese firms are increasingly building these factories in places like Brazil and Hungary, creating local jobs there and completely circumventing established trade walls, should global policymakers maybe shift their focus entirely? Move away from just managing imports and instead focus on managing inward investment from China? What kind of control does the West truly lose or perhaps gain when the manufacturing moves physically closer to home, but the ultimate owner remains Chinese? Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.